fruitful. So good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again in this lecture. In this chilly night, we are hosting an interesting event about geoarchaeology that Paschalis Zafiriadis, our archaeologist and advisor, will present shortly. I would like to thank you and to say that we are very truthful to our recent mandate about the Institute, and we try to attract the Norwegian academic community as much as we can. So welcome, Dr. Fallu, and thank you for being here with us.
I would also like to thank our in-person and Zoom participants for attending the lecture. Tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Daniel Fallu, who will introduce us to his collaborative work on agricultural terraces of this omnipresent across time and space landscape feature. Dr. Fallu is a postdoctoral researcher for the TerrACE project at the Tromsø University Museum at the University of Tromsø in Norway. Dr. Fallu is a geoarchaeologist, and his research interests include soil micromorphology, engineered landscapes, climate change, and resiliency. His research, which applies microscopic and geochemical methods, focuses on detecting the human impact on the environment and human adaptation to changing environments and more sudden disasters. In his current position, Dr. Fallu is involved in synthesizing geoarchaeological, paleobotanical, and geochronological data to explore the history of terraced agriculture in Europe, with a focused interest in projects and case studies from Greece. Dr. Fallu is currently involved in reconstructing the history of the agricultural system at Hieromadres in Crete, and has conducted a soil survey of the terraces on the island of Tinos. He has also aided in the geoarchaeological interpretation of other sites in Greece, including Mycenae, Tiryns, Lecheon, Glass, Nicolia, and Agios Vasilios. Dr. Fallu will focus tonight on presenting some of the most recent results of the TerrACE project, focusing on the theme research on the construction of late Bronze Age terraces at Hieromadres in East Crete, and how the employment of cutting-edge soil DNA and other scientific methods are reshaping the ways we understand human adaptations to natural catastrophes and climatic change within the context of long-term agricultural development. It's time to pass the microphone to our speaker, so let us all warmly welcome Dr. Daniel Fallu.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. Again, I'm Daniel Fallu, and in case you've noticed, yes, I'm a member of the Norwegian academic community. No, I'm not Norwegian. And that is why I misspelled the Norwegian word for university on the slide. Just to forewarned, there is some science in this discussion, but I promise for anyone who's more culturally focused, there is one picture of a fresco. I do have some background in classical archaeology, and I do like nice pictures. And so with that, I'd like to, somehow this works. Okay. I'm going to start off with the definition of a terrace, just because you would not believe how much debate there is about this. I like to just be very simple about this. It's a flat space that's created artificially by people. This is when we're talking about agricultural or construction terraces. An agricultural terrace, as you see the quote here, it's just a modification of the slope with the purpose of changing the slope to better agriculture. I will be vague there, because the reality is that in many cases terraces can serve different, what we call ecosystem services, in terms of making things wetter, making things drier, making things colder, making things warmer, depending on where you are, depending how the terrace is constructed. What you can say is it's an artificial flat space on a slope intended to improve agricultural produce. You can make a terrace many ways. You can cut in and pile it up on one side and pile it up downslope or upslope. This is a cut and fill terrace. These are probably the most common, at least the one that ends up being diagrammed the most. Aggradation slow terraces, check dams, often not considered the same thing as terraces. often studied completely separately, but part of the discussion because they do accumulate soil and they are often used for agriculture. Cut terraces are terraces, but are sort of like the evil terraces. Because the cut terraces are the most common nowadays because they're the easiest to make with machinery, and they're actually the thing that's increasing erosion on a lot of slopes. And in many cases, it's cut terraces that are endangering the older terraces, which are often cut and fill or aggregate or graded terraces. Most terraces, particularly in this part of the world, will have a stone wall. Terraces can have basically any sort of revetment that you want. Can be ramped earth, can be trees. In other parts of the world, we have lynchets, gentle rolling artificial terraces in hillsides associated with pre-medieval societies in colder climates like Britain and Scandinavia. We don't have them in Greece, and I won't be talking about them again. If you want to know about lynchets, we can have a discussion later. So, terraces in Europe. This is a map of that we've managed to whip up just to show general distribution between terraces across Europe. And yes, lynchets are there. That was a slight lie. This is the last time I'll mention them. So they're mostly concentrated along the Mediterranean coast and also in the Alps, where, as you can imagine, flat arable land is at a premium. And most research to date will tell you that terraces are generally a medieval phenomenon. Now, those of us in the Greek-Roman world know that really they're not. But the vast majority of terrace construction that happens across time happens in the medieval period. That is not our concern. We will try to go a bit further back than that. So, questions about terraces. The first is the obvious and the archaeological one. When are terraces first employed in Europe and Aegean? They're employed quite early on further east, 6,000 years ago in Yemen. As we get into the Levant and into the Aegean, the dates seem to get later. And this is an important question to address, is when do they show up and why is there a time gap, and is there a time gap? Where? That's blank because the question where sort of stands out on its own. Where are they appearing? I've already mentioned they tend to be they're around the Mediterranean. We can be a bit more specific. Where are they being cited with respect to archaeological sites, and where in terms of bedrock, where in terms of soil? How? What methods are they used, and what's the variation in the methods? Is there actually a formula for building a terrace, or is this something that's very extempore? And that's a discussion you can have, the very in-depth discussion you can have is there really a terrace packet of technology that's traveling or diffusing from place to place, or is it something that people are coming up with on their own? The probable answer is both of those things are happening at the same time. And then why? This is probably the most difficult question, and we'll get to it a bit at the end. But in terms of why terraces are built, with the TerrACE project, which I'll discuss, with our project, what we're really trying to understand is the driving forces, the balance between climatic forces, demographic expansion, economic change, and the list can go on and on. Our methods that we're applying here try to get at each of these questions and sort of focus the areas we can. The obvious start is geochronology. Now, not so long ago, terraces were considered not so datable. Reworking of agricultural soil can obliterate whatever charcoal may or may not be there, and often what you end up with is pottery, and you can't dig everywhere there's a terrace. In some cases, that's a very bad idea for the stability of the slope, and terraces, for the majority of the time they've been studied in archaeology, were done through surface scatters. This is Lynn Koppel's dissertation, 2012, one of my favorite, I'll call it early work on terraces, because I think it's the first great synoptic demonstration of how far you can go. And we take it a step forward, and this is not just us, but right now this is the time of OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. I will go into this very briefly for those who are less familiar. Optically stimulated luminescence is a direct dating technique. You take samples in the dark and you expose them to light, and the simple principle being is that certain crystal grains will accumulate dose energy over time from their surroundings, and when they are hit with strong sunlight, they release all of that energy. That energy can be recorded and modeled to a date. This is different from other dating methods, radiocarbon, because instead of dating something that's moving within the soil, you're dating the grains of the soil itself, and you're not just dating, you're dating the last time it was exposed to sunlight. This is particularly useful when we get to geoengineering terrace construction, because this is dating actual moments where the soil has been disturbed. Now, take that a step forward. For about the past 10 years, there's been a new device in use called a portable optically stimulated luminescence meter. It's the exact same principle, except for you don't try to date anything. We have a small black box, as you see in the picture, and you put that in a dark room or a van or a bathroom in your dig hotel. You take some samples, you keep them as dark as you can, and you get the relative intensity of that luminescence signal that gives you a relative idea of how long it's been since these sediments were last exposed to sunlight. Now you can, through so much work that it makes it no longer a portable method, actually get something approaching a date from this method, but it's generally not feasible and not advisable, and you're better off going back to the traditional laboratory techniques. So here, POSL, I'll be using it in this talk and in our research as sort of an anchor, our relative chronology anchor, to discuss not only the deposition of the soils or the sediments over time, but identifying disturbances from the soil, because this luminescent signal does not just give you relative age, but if you get, let's call them wonky signals, reversals, this indicates something, the flipping of a soil. So you get some soil that isn't exposed enough to sunlight to bleach it, and that creates a too old signal in the middle of your relatively nice curve. And in OSL dating, that's a problem. In POSL, where we can take as many samples as we want and actually see the difference all the way up the curve, that's data. That tells us something about the way that the soil was deposited and disturbed in the past. As you see here, this is from another terrace research team, TerrACE, based out of England, doing some work here in Greece as well. This is their 2017 publication on terraces in Catalonia. And just to give you an idea of how this method works, these blue and red dots here are showing you the relative intensities of this signal. So you get a bit of an idea of how we take a sample and compare that against how we think the terrace was constructed to understand the relative ages of the soil disturbance. If you have a slow terrace or a check dam, like we mentioned, you get a gradual change. As you can see with this bottom one, it says deposition. In the top two, you can see more distinct separations between the signals, and this is because the soils were disturbed and redeposited in one unit. And then when you get a big jump, that's stability or erosion. Either nothing's happened or material has only been removed, and then new material is put down at a later date with a much lower intensity. So you know that this is a new episode of terrace development, new soil emplacement. PXRF, lots of people are familiar with, originally developed for scrapyards, and what has now become the geoarchaeologist's best friend. Quick elemental analysis in the field and in the lab. Works on fluorescence principles. You fire X-rays at a substance. It causes the electrons to move around. When they shoot back to their original position, they release a certain amount of energy. You collect that energy, you can calculate how far those electrons moved, and that gives you proportions of the different elements in the substance. Here we're using it to look both at the general composition of the soil to understand how the sort of topography affects the soils and how they've been moved around, as well as the change in the soil in time. And here you see soil phosphorus plotted out. And I show phosphorus because phosphorus is the first thing you look for when you're looking for human disturbance. If you're doing more traditional bulk analysis, you look for phosphates. If you've got a PXRF, you just look for phosphorus, and you expect with manuring and other intensive cultivation to see a jump or a rapid increase in phosphorus levels from the decaying organic material found in whatever manure of choice. We combine these two to get an idea of what's happening in each soil section. These examples are from Norwegian terraces in the vicinity of Ålesund and Geiranger. And just here showing that you can see where your luminescence changes, and you can see where your phosphorus changes, and this gives you the beginning of a story of the soil. So and you'll notice in these two places, I really like to point, and I apologize. Here you have these reversals, and this is what I was talking about, these disturbances that we can start to say something about that normally would be a true pain if you were trying to date with luminescence. Here we can say something because if when we look at the soil itself and we look further at the chemical data, what it seems to be here is that these reversals are grass turfs that have been flipped over so that the roots are up and the grass is down. And this is a traditional Scandinavian method of building and building terraces. And there are examples of terraces built with this technique other places in Norway, in the south. And even today, this technique is used to create what's called fast beds or easy beds, because those root material creates sort of jump starts the soil underneath. And that's a common modern organic agriculture technique for urban settings. And so here we already have something that we can say just based on the POSL. And as you see, again, that constant increase in phosphorus suggesting continued use. Micromorphology, which is the method I was first trained in. We take soil samples, we impregnate them with resin, polyester, or epoxy. We look at them under a microscope. In the case of agriculture, we're generally looking again for signs that things have been jumbled up. We look for clay coatings from soil formation that have been broken and rotated and moved around. We look for voids in the soil that have been filled with fine material that was made loose from plowing and that's been washed back down through the soil. This is not always great in particularly arid environments, and you'll see that it's been a bit of a headache for me with geometers, but we do it anyway because it's a good place to start. And the exciting one, DNA, so sedimentary environmental DNA. We take a sort of a sterile in situ sample in a small plastic tube, and we process that for DNA all at once, and we get the entire get sort of the signal of the entire soil. And this is a PCR enhanced reaction, so you're not looking at the actual original DNA, but you're enhancing the signal so you can get an idea of everything that's present in the soil. You're artificially replicating it over and over to make sure that you get everything. And this is just an example of readings from another one of our sites in Italy, just to show you with a sort of the end result, because the beginning of the process isn't interesting. It's just me shoving a tube into some dirt. And here what you see is the higher the number, the more present that particular plant is or organism is in the soil. And here we have some familiar things, grapevines, wheat, walnut. And this is what we're looking for mostly in terraces, these crops and indicators of human involvement, but also things that might be surprising. So these two, Medicago and Hyoscyamus, which are medical herbs. And this is, again, things can surprise you. And this is a terrace from Sicily, which has produced some particularly nice results. And the medical herbs was a nice left turn for us. Putting that all together and is where we get this story. So this is just a really simple example. I won't even really give you a map, but it's from northern Italy. It's from the Soave wine region, and if you drink white wine, you might be familiar with Soave. Probably right now the best advertised white wine on earth. And we were actually asked out by the consortium of wine growers of Soave to perform some analysis on their terraces. What they wanted to know is, were their terraces, these terraces, built for wine, or were they built for something else and readapted? We went a bit further because some of us are archaeologists and wanted to construct a cultural and socioeconomic narrative. And what we were able to do, putting together our OSL dates, our POSL, our soil chemistry, is map the terrace construction in the region against some known historical events that we have. So we have probably no terraces until the Roman period, although we do have a stable soil around 1000 BC that's returning a very interesting and strange DNA signal for barley. But we're working on that, so don't get excited. We're trying to figure out if it's an error. But when we move into the Roman period, we actually get this red zone, which shows that this is really the first accumulation of soils in one of our areas, an upland place called Bologna. And this happens to be after the major Roman road was constructed through the region. So this seems to be an economic response. As we move forward in time, we get our main terrace construction, which again is moving into the medieval period. And we have two different spikes in our dates, which are interesting. The first one has to do with the rapid expansion of the castle in the city of Soave, leading to its eventual burning after several conflicts. It was a very contentious strategic place at the time. And then a second spike later on, which is after all of this conflict has died down and the castle has changed hands and being sold as a private farm. And so you have a very nice classical economic expansion, and then you have this change in use, which leads to the reconstruction of terraces for perhaps less highfalutin purposes than when it was a functioning castle. In Bologna, in our highland area, which is the diagram up top, we found no grape DNA or no vine DNA whatsoever. But what we did find is grain. And these were low sloping terraces at a high elevation, perfect for sort of broadcast farming. When we look at our smaller step terraces from the same region, we were getting basically nothing but vine DNA. This is the distribution of the project in general. We've done 26 surveys to date, and we're trying to do a transect across Europe so that we can apply DNA as much as we can, because you see that line, that's the line where temperatures are above and below annual mean temperatures are above and below 10 centigrade, and DNA preserves better below 10 centigrade than above 10 centigrade. With the exception being if you're in really high altitude regions in the Alps, that line is a bit fuzzy. So, I don't need to tell you that we did not have too high hopes for DNA in Crete. Now, enough with the method background, and more onto the site and the discussion. So Hieromandris, for those of you who don't know, is in Faris Crete, near the coast in Zakros. It's a series of sort of herringbone, straight geometric walls, cutting the slope, surrounded by an enclosure wall with a guardhouse, and a series of two catch basins, hydrologic basins, artificial, at the top of the valley. The cultural chronology is LM1A, 1B for the construction of the terraces. And the questions we have coming in first is, were the questions for the general questions of research, and why, part of why we were asked to come in is to secure these dates. I feel a bit embarrassed doing this, considering the individual responsible for the excavation is in the room. So, but the interesting thing about the terrace walls is that in the foundation of one of the terrace walls is found a pithos with soil containing tephra from the Centurion eruption. This also contains some snail shells that will come into play later, I promise you. This is a general overlook of the site, and I think me being a geoarchaeologist and not a cultural person, I'll move on before I embarrass myself too much. But our main question is, are these agricultural terraces? Do we have any evidence of cultivation? At least from the soil end. So our team came in a couple of summers ago, and we cited 6 locations where we put out 13 profiles across the site. You can see the distribution here. I don't expect you to remember the colors, but those are the colors I use in the diagrams later. And we first sampled for the POSL, taking small tubes for those dark samples, and then went across and we shot in the field the profiles to get the PXRF, the elemental signature. And then we took those samples back, and we've also run all of the soil again in the lab for PXRF, just to be certain. Our team does phytoliths. This is the only site we are not doing the phytoliths. Jörg is doing the phytoliths, and we'll have exciting results some other time, I'm sure. But so starting off, we sunk in 12 large tubes for that traditional OSL dating, and the dates were Holocene, which was really encouraging, because it would be weird if they weren't. However, these were very broad error margins. So if you look here, you see 2.56. That's 2.56 thousand years in either direction. 4.33. So that's 4,330 years plus or minus. That's 6,000 years plus or minus 4,000 years. You can see that this isn't very good for us. And this is because the material was relatively too fine and didn't have enough responsive quartz that could hold that luminescent signal. And this is unfortunately not an uncommon story in certain parts of Greece. So we have a general idea that we do have younger soils here, because it is encouraging that these are not very old soils. And this was already suggested by Leonidas and by Floyd McCoy, that this was a valley that was scoured by erosion in the past, so the soils would not be very old. Not talking tens and tens of thousand years, just a few thousand. Now what we're looking at, you should not do archaeology this big, but that's what we're aiming for, is LM1A, 1B. Because we have the pottery saying it's LM1A, 1B, we have the tephra from the Centurion eruption, so we should have something happening at LM1A, 1B on the site. We have that late OSL date, which probably represents the abandonment of the terraces. Somewhere in that light blue, the curve is the abandonment of the terraces. So we're on the right track. So we did something that no one really wants to ever have to do, is we resorted to radiocarbon dating snail shells. Now, if you don't know, the problem there is snails consume calcium carbonate, which has old carbon in it. They not only consume it from the soil and the rock, but they sometimes eat each other's shells. So if a snail has been eating old carbon and consolidating in its shell, and then there's another snail who's also been eating old carbon, and then eats a snail who's been eating the more old carbon, you get very, very old dates. We were a bit lucky here in that the dates were not too much older than we needed them to be. But we had a feeling that that's the effect we were dealing with, so we went and we dated some modern snail shells when Leonidas and I had a lovely hot day in July, crouching under bushes looking for fresh snail shells. And we got 2 dates of 1011 and 2431 carbon date age. And these were from snails that had fresh coloration on them. They had to be very, very recent. We couldn't find any live snails because they were smart. They were out of the sun. When we adjust those dates, one of those dates, the younger date, actually puts us in that LM1A B territory. Is this a confirmation of the cultural dating? Sort of. We will have to do a bit more work. We'll have to understand exactly what's causing that older snail shell date. We'll probably have to date more snail shells, more modern snail shells. And we'll perhaps resort to a few other carbon dating methods, direct carbon dating, microscopic carbon fractions in the soil, which is a much more expensive and much more time-consuming method, but will help us narrow that down. So, to sort of start the whole advanced methods discussion, is we have POSL on this terrace, which is held back by wall 11. And this is where we got that date that's somewhere between the Bronze Age and the Roman period. And when we take those luminescence values, we actually can start to separate this out into events. And what we get is our oldest soil underneath, which has some consistent high luminescence values, and above that a gradual decrease, which represents slow accumulation. These terraces probably started out effectively as check-down terraces, where the walls were put in place to allow slow accumulation. And then we get a jumble of similarly sort of ranged luminescence above that, which appears to be soil that has been in place in a relatively short period of time from an older deposit. So you see that back and forth, and it's all over the place, but it's confined within a range. And so you have soil that contains some of that older luminescent signal, but it's been redeposited at one time. And you see that reversal there is probably preserved from surface reworking, so could be plowing or some other method of just turning over the immediate surface. It would be very shallow. So in this case, that's about 10 centimeters, and we tend to expect more like 20. But that's the sort of thing we're looking for, is that turnover. Again, pain in the behind if you're trying to date via OSL. But for this method, it's actually a good thing. It helps us say something. Now, when we take the geochemistry and we go very simply with a PCA and say, what do things look like? So we have our parent material here, the stuff that there isn't soil, or that's not close enough to soil, or the modern soil. And you can already see that there are some things that are obvious. So the limestone is the bedrock under a lot of the site. It is not controlling too much of the chemical composition, because there is a lot of recent development of the soil. The closest soils to the limestone are the soils that are most evidently not reworked in an agricultural fashion. These are from outside the terrace system within the enclosure wall, believed possibly to be an animal enclosure, but they are not agriculturally reworked soils. You see a relatively slow increase in phosphorus and a sudden spike up top, or sudden jump up top, which could have to do with more recent climate effects and decay. But you don't see in the POSL, you don't really see any major perturbations, you just see accumulation. This is just basically weathered limestone that's accumulating over time and washing in. Another terrace, which is higher up, constrained by wall 18, is interesting simply because this is cut into a marly carbonate substrate, and it retains the chemical signature of that marl and sort of separates it out from the rest of the soils. The majority of the soils look like each other, and they look like the old soils underneath. And importantly, they're all sort of pulled apart from the unworked soils by their concentrations of potassium, copper, zinc, phosphorus, and rubidium to some extent. And these are good indications of, in one way or another, of human augmented soils. Potassium, phosphorus, zinc are all related to the decay of organic material. Copper is related to accumulation in soil formation, and rubidium is related to the weathering of fine material in soils. And so it can give you some idea of the advancement of soil formation. So when we put these together a little bit, and again in that wall 11 profile, we can see that we get potassium and phosphorus increasing right at that reversal, at that perturbation. So we can say at this point that this is very likely a cultivation surface, at least from the luminescence data and the geochemical data. You can see in general from the potassium and the phosphorus that after that gradual accumulation period, you start to get an increase, probably in organic deposition, and this is what you might call more intensive work. So you have originally the just allowing the soils to accumulate, possibly working those to some extent, but then you get that more sudden deposition, probably from soil being cut from above or below and then placed on top. And this comes with it organic material in the form of manure, or possibly in the form of dead plants from a previous cultivation. And this increases the organic content, which in the long run increases concentrations of potassium, phosphorus. You can even see a slight increase in zinc there, although zinc is a weaker indicator. In general, when we look across the site, so this is the lower basin, which is at the top of the site, and the wall 15 area, which is down sort of at the base of the terrace system, within the terrace system, is you can see this increase in phosphorus across the profile and across time. And this again is a good general indication that we have sudden or consistent additions of organic material to the soils, which are changing the geochemistry of the soils as they wash down into the bottom of the site. Micromorphology. I wanted so badly for this to give us more data. However, we can say a few things. We can see that these are soils that are relatively slow forming, and we can see that they're soils forming under drier conditions, where we have strong formations of calcite in voids and underneath stones. This is fairly common in Greece in general. This just tells us that there's nothing strange going on hydrologically here that would cause other things happening. We have some redeposition of fine material clays, possibly into voids, into the general matrix, which could indicate disturbance of the surface, but this degree is so weak. Now, this possibly could just be because of the nature of the soil, that there just isn't enough of this fine material, and that the agriculture isn't quite intensive enough to be depositing this. And this might be a negative result, but it also is a positive result in the sense that it tells us something that there is a level of there is a threshold of intensity that isn't being met in the disturbances of these soils. so you can sort of begin to work yourself into questions of exactly how these we know now these soils probably are being agriculturally worked, but we can start questioning the actual intensity of it. And then just general jumbles of things, organic materials, broken clay nodules, and oxide nodules from former soil formation, indicating that the stuff is jumbled and reworked. So there is something happening here, in that these soils are not just accumulating and being let be. This is generally more jumbling than you would expect from insect and root activity in the region. The DNA. This is exciting and not exciting at the same time, and I'll explain why. These results are much better than what we thought they would be. We thought that would all say 0. Crete is one of the hottest places in Europe, and these are very dry and drained soils and very unlikely to preserve any soil DNA whatsoever based on the current understanding of soil DNA preservation. There have been recent studies, however, suggesting that calcite content and clay content can severely buffer DNA. This is probably not very old DNA, but we are getting good numbers for things that should be in the area. Cashew family, mint family, daisy family. There's Cretan thyme in the DNA evidence. There's goat, but this is probably past century or past 2 centuries, and we can't really say anything more than that, except this is far better than we expected, but not known. But still very interesting. Now, just to get into the archaeology, we've already discussed that these terraces are built after the Theron eruption. How long after, unclear, although if the rest of the shells tend to behave with the good shell, then perhaps we can be a bit more clear, not so long after the low chronology for the eruption. The question then goes into this TerrACE technology and what's normal for the time. And this is an example that was cited by Leonidas as well, from the flotilla fresco at Arctic. At the final arrival town off to the side, you can see this hill that has these walls and that has these horizontal structures and these little black triangles, which are one person at least suggests are beehives. This very much looks like a terrace system, and not only does it look like a terrace system, but Leonidas and I were just discussing, it looks very much like Hieromandus, with the wall, with the water source, with the tower nearby. It looks very familiar to someone who's seen Hieromandus. Now, is it the exact same thing? No. But what this possibly shows us is that while the construction of Hieromandus might be constrained by climatic perturbations of Santorini, for example, there has been some evidence, underpublished, of flash floods in the area dating to around the eruption. It is not something that is just introduced out of nowhere, and not even this particular sort of highly organized style. This is something that predates, and this is a pre-existing technology. Also, there's some discussion over whether this is agricultural terraces, whether it's beehives. Could be both. I mean, look at Greece today. You see beehives on terraces. Go to Tinos and you see beehives built into the terrace walls. The reconstruction and so this gets me into like sort of the final grand narrative, is looking at the agricultural technologies and terraces across Greece and Europe, and I just thought this would give people something to think about. Is that when we look at the more securely, culturally, and analytically dated terraces that are published, we see that they tend to approach 2000 BC, and so that early to mid second millennium BC seems to be important. And because I started as a mainland person, I will mention that the GLA drainage happens also within this time frame. And this is a hydrologic model from Greece published in 2016, just to show this could absolutely, at least in Crete, have something to do with climatic effects, particularly if you're going through a cold and dry spell. You might need to manage water and soil more carefully. However, as you expand out to Europe in general, what you notice is that you get sort of three definite periods of growth, and the earliest one of those seems to be in this same time period. And through our research and through collating other research, what we have found is that this does seem to be an important period in terrace construction. So we have the terraces at Ingram, England, which are early to mid Bronze Age England, British, just published in Antiquity yesterday. I'll show it to you in a second. But and then we have the published from 2017 JFA Christine Rondu terraces from Villalta, which the earliest, very good study for carbon dating terraces, earliest at 1300, and then the Cretan examples that I mentioned earlier. Is this, and here's the, just a bit of a shameless plug. Just came out, earliest published terraces in England, dated through the high pi, which is where you burn off all of the excess and weak carbon to try to get at the durable fraction so that you can try to find the oldest available date in the soil. And we had to do this because the soil was andesite and did not have an OSL signal, or a reliable OSL signal. And so we had to really go down into this sort of more experimental method of dating. And then the Bronze Age and terraces, there seems to be an expansion. Is it the introduction? Possibly, possibly not. What's more important is it seems that in multiple places we're getting the use of terraces, fairly elaborate terraces, at a time that's fairly later than the actual introduction of terraces farther east. And you can start to ask questions. Is this climate? Well, there happens in very different places that have very different geologies, different slope processes. The slopes will react different to the same climate. Climate is not a strong enough explanation. Then you get into more anthropological discussions. Is it demographic explosion? Is it changes in administration? Probably both. And something we've been working on discussing, we're trying to access more and more with the DNA is, does it have to do with changes in specific changes in strategies, diversification of produce? We saw the beehives on the terraces. We saw the medical herbs in that example I showed at the very beginning. Diversification seems to be one of sort of the silent underlying factors in terrace development. Terraces do not only stabilize the soil, but they provide a stable environment where you can diversify, where you can change what you're doing on the soils, where you can combine olive and wheat or grapes. And so that's sort of the direction that we're continuing and trying to understand the uses of terraces over time in Europe. And thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for this extremely interesting lecture. So, any questions for Daniel?
I won't be offended if you have a question.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. As you were showing your map, and talking about the bigger picture reasons to, the circumstances under which terraces are developed, I think it has to have a lot to do with basically need for kind of improved productivity, right?
Intensification, demographic, yeah.
Yeah, and so when I was looking at the map here, you know, of course, since I'm working in the Cyclades, I'm thinking, oh, you have to do things in the Cyclades, because it strikes me that that's where there's the greatest need, right, in these circumscribed small island environments.
Yeah.
And I think that they'd just be great targets for seeing early intensification of land use and the need for this type of land amelioration.
I agree completely. We had this discussion just before. I think that there's one problem in that, is that a lot of these environments in the Cyclades are going to be even more erosive than Hieromandros. And Hieromandros was fairly erosive to begin with. And this heavily constrains how accurate you can be with dating. The POSL helped significantly in understanding the movement of the soils. But yeah, I mean, it's the logical place to look in the Aegean, because to me it's pretty obvious that this all predates whatever's happening in the rest of Europe. And it's not necessarily transmission. It could just be that this is sort of like a laboratory setting where things happen early and they accelerate. Because the Hieromandros is far more elaborate than what we're seeing even at later periods in France or in England. And so there is something unique that's happening in the Aegean with respect to TerrACE technology in specific, I would say.
The other thing I noticed, just if I may make one more comment, is when you were saying, when you were showing the fresco from TerrACE and the walls with the little triangles in it. I mean, this looks just like what we always call modern terraces that are all over places like Kypnos and Kea and places like this that have these little triangles built into them. I mean, how old does this technique go?
The goat sheds and things. Yeah, that's I don't know. I think that's a discussion to be shouted about over beer, probably.
It was super interesting. Thanks for
this is not my observation at all. This is from Papagio, and has been referenced multiple times by the natives in publishing discussing Hieromandros. But it does very. I mean, you don't get that lucky that often with iconography and landscape features. You really don't. They're telling you as someone who's worked in like Bronze Age, who's done research in Bronze Age landscape management, Tyrann's Dam, and Mycenaean floods, and all of this. None of those have pictures about them. And this is, if it is what it is, it's phenomenal that we have this to use as a comparison.
Does Hieromandros have the little triangles built into the walls?
No.
Well, no. As far whatever we have excavated, there is not this feature. But be that as it may, as far as I understand, these triangles, the Santorini fresco, they are on the thread. They are not a part of the structures.
That's the interpretation
so
of the
should be either say. I mean, my idea was that there were, say, young shoots of young plants, pines maybe. And Kyrilli Papageorgiou had this quite nice idea that there may be beehives. I mean, not the clay ones, like those from Bronze Age Crete or classical Athens, for instance, but those made by organic materials. And then again, there is Tom Strasser's idea that this is not an artificial feature after all, but just the breakages and the lines formed by the Theran geology. He sees similarities with cliffs around the caldera. What has some similarities still, but it does look artificial to me.
And the fact that you have what appears to be the masonry drawing is...
Well, there is a perivolos, definitely, an enclosure wall. And be it as it may, it's not just that feature. In the same, I mean, to the right of this feature, there is this representation of an enclosure wall, a circular enclosure with a tree inside and a fountain nearby. So it is they had an interest in this, and this may be due to the fact that this is a narrative composition.
Yes, please.
I would like to ask you about how much the plowing affects, or the old plowing affected the POSL. Because you said that the grains of the sediments, they see the light and they give you some signals. So if this happens over and over through
Right.
time,
So
how does this affect?
you'll get an averaging out for when that's plowed. So, and this is sort of what that Hieromandros wall 11 looks like, is you have, it's, because there are some grains that won't be exposed and some grains that will. Plowing does not expose everything uniformly, so you will not get complete bleaching no matter what. What you will get is sort of a constraint, a column constraint on the OSL that will, so you'll have lots of variation, but you'll within sort of a vertical
I understand.
zone. That's if you have constant and continuous plowing. Because you are working in your older dates, you're exposing some of your older sediments, you're working in your younger sediments, but there are limits imposed on them. So you get, but it will be homogenized, and depending on the intensity of the plowing and the period over which it's plowed, that band could be very wide and prove quite useless in the end. But in this case, the soils can be quite hard, and it seems like again that the whatever methods are being used are not particularly intensive. Why we still have that very clear reversal that's preserved. But again, remember that's also at the very top, so that's the last, and then you have a burial on top. And so you will be able to see the most recent plowing event most easily. And lab time is still an issue after COVID, but we have a experiment set up with our experimental farm in Tromsø. We have some cores that to look exactly how plowing affects the ozone luminescence, and my supervisor's waiting to get in a lab and run some of that. So.
And if I can make another question. About the DNA slide that you showed us, I didn't understand it very correctly. So this sample comes from where? From the upper layer?
It's not one sample, it's 8 samples.
8 samples from the
It's
same?
all the samples we took.
Ah, okay.
Because it was very unlikely to work, and we were right, it did not work correctly. Or it did not give us archaeological. They are very low numbers of species, and they're species that don't tell us particularly much. And the soils are all relatively shallow to begin with. And if I remember correctly, so that's MCH1, which is, yeah, I can do this. It's like 10 or 20 centimeters depth, if I remember correctly. There's not a broad enough signal for us to do anything with it, really. The results are sort of, they're good, they're correct. We're getting enough reads to say that this is preserved DNA, but they're sort of generic Cretan post-human soil DNA signature, and there's not much you can say about it. We're not learning anything new from this, really. Yes?
Sorry, a follow-up question on that. Is there a reason you chose this depth for the sampling of the DNA from
Yeah.
the surface?
So they're not all that depth. They were generally targeted to find what were believed to be intact soil packets in the field.
Okay.
And I'm actually generally the field sampling technician for the project for DNA, but in this case it's actually my boss who did the sampling. I'll call him, you can ask him his logic on it. But our protocol is generally to look for, the same as you would with OSL dating. Try not to get the boundaries, and try to be low enough that you're not getting the root material, the major root material from the top, and try to laterally avoid any tap roots, and try to find the finest, smallest grain size looking material you can. And so that's the general sort of overall logic behind sampling for field sampling for set of DNA and soils. And so these were all fine, generally fine materials, so not a lot of stones and not a lot of sandier particles. They were all below 10, 15 centimeters, and they were all taken in what was believed to be the middle of a stratigraphic unit, vertically.
Was that a graphic unit that was dated earlier than the
No, field observed, well, dated pottery,
Okay.
yeah, but field observed stratigraphy, which
Okay.
was
And all of them were younger than the minor one, you said, right?
when when I say they're younger, it's because the preservation, it's the odds of us having 3,000 plus year preservation here are so slim, so incredibly slim, that these results being as decent as they are suggests that they're very young. That's
Okay.
and we have more expensive ways to look at the damage pattern in the DNA to actually determine this. This is due to funding constraints. This is not very high up on the list, particularly, like I said, because it doesn't really give us much more interpretive power. So we're working more on some of our other sites to actually map out the DNA damage to determine whether things really are intrusive or contamination. But these are not contaminant. These are just expected for the soil. Just we weren't expecting the preservation. But yeah, I mean the preservation DNA taphonomy is a very young field, and could this be old? It's very unlikely, but we could discover something next week and say, okay, maybe we're thinking maybe this could be another 100 years older than we thought it was. But these are good results in terms of DNA preservation. In terms of their archaeological interpretive power, there's not much we can say from them at the moment. So.
Let's see if we have any questions from our
Oh, yeah.
online attendants.
How? Oh, there's numbers on the screen.
Always.
That's a long question.
Yeah,
I like it.
And also can curious about the introduction of terraces and how it maps out the settlement patterns, landscape features, and their patterns in terms of where terracing first begins. E.g., do they first appear on lower slopes near stream outflows or easily farmed natural landscapes and then build up into uplands or more remote landscapes? You want to take one question at a time?
I think it's one question, but I think I got it. And I think Leonidas can sort of jump in on this with hieromanders.
Sorry, we're discussing and I didn't catch up.
Okay.
Yeah.
But okay, well I can start, and I can start actually not with hieromanders, since this question went to the general introduction. I will actually bring up the English example, is that because the sort of the history of cultivation, prehistoric cultivation in England, gives a good understanding of these processes, is that when you look at Bronze Age or pre-Iron Age cultivation in England, whether that's terraces or whether that's later stuff, they very strongly radiate out from settlements. And as the settlements move to different places, you get this sort of onion effect. So if you go to a hillside in northern England, at the base of the hill you'll have medieval, and you'll have your cordon rig and all of that very nice English countryside field systems. As you go up, you'll find some evidence of Roman, and as you go up further, you'll find your undisturbed evidence of your Bronze Age. And this is just because this is where the Bronze Age settlements were further up the hillside. These were hill forts. These were things that up top, and this is cited entirely due to population, just the population density and settlement location. In the case of England, there is no stream there. There's no stream nearby. There's a river a kilometer and a half away down the valley, the Breamish, that actually forms the local valley. In the case of Hieromandris, there's a local stream running through it, and it's also, again, this enclosed environment that has this plateau above that has a natural concavity that seems to redirect water particularly well. So again, it's hard to put any one driving factor because Hieromandris seems very particularly chosen and engineered, whereas something like the Ingram Valley settlements or even settlements you can see in the Alps and the Pyrenees and mountain environments in Western Europe. This more just has to do with where populations are moving in different times. And in England, it often had to do with defense. In the Alps and other places, it had more to do with changes in the annual temperature and humidity and moving up and down for pasturage and things like this. So it's, I hate to say, both and neither, but it's I think the population center is really important, and probably for the exact siting of the terraces, it's the strongest driving factor. Because not all terraces are directly irrigated. If I hope that answers the question.
Right. Okay. Any other?
That was Chris.
Any other questions? Or yes.
Daniel, sorry. I'm an undergrad, so forgive me if this is a silly question. It's common sense there.
There are no silly questions, just silly people.
Surely the foundation of the walls themselves would be they're the oldest part of the terraces, where they would start building the terraces, right? So why aren't samples being taken from the bases of the walls?
I did. There are two. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought that
We've taken OSL samples from directly underneath the walls. The problem directly underneath too. One of those returns no datable material whatsoever, and one has yet to be dated, I think. And I've also taken POSL from the base of that wall, from the base of the wall 11, and it just has to do with me being neglectful and not using the most recent version of that graph. But there are 2 points that should be added to that graph that just fall in line with the sort of the cloud of the Paleosol underneath. So you can actually see them here, and their results are just in this range.
And is there any continuity to the actual, methods they use to build the walls?
You can answer this better than I can.
Well, it depends. These are terrace walls at Hieromandris. They are, say, what we call megalithic. No comparison to Stonehenge. I mean that they are built with large boulders. The average length being, maximum dimension being something like 60 to 70 centimeters. But they can be 1 meter or more in length as well. So they had to transport the boulders from uphill. It was a labor-intensive project. Then on the uphill side, they were filling the gap with the pre-existing soil with what we call the riser fill, that is with dense stone package. So this latter feature, it reoccurs. One can see it in terraces built in, say, early modern times throughout Greece. But then again, other terraces, maybe in the same regions, they just make a soil surface, they clear it and they abut the wall on it. There's no riser fill. That is to say that there are techniques that are, say, diachronic. One can see them in different times and places, like the riser fill, which is quite useful for, say, allowing rainwater to go downslope without causing the riser wall to collapse. But it all has to do with, say, the desire of the owner of the plots to invest into building terrace walls that will last in time as well. in any event, the megalithic masonry is something that is quite specific in Minoan times.
And even the riser fill is quite is a bit idiosyncratic. It's a wide there's a very wide lateral stance of it compared to riser fills in a lot of later terraces when we're talking in terms of Europe.
Yes. Well, there is some variation at Hieromontes as well. Say one of the walls on the eastern side of the valley, the width of the riser fill was quite narrow in comparison to other walls. But yes, as a rule, what you say is right.
And riser fill is riser fill is a massive discussion of people who spend a lot of time discussing terraces, and there are some of us. It's very unclear the purposes of different uses of riser fill, and because sometimes it appears that riser fill is very, very deliberate, like a hieromandris, where it's sort of put in place almost as part of the wall itself, and then the soil is accumulated. In a lot of other places, what you'll get is what you'd think makes more sense is that you have the wall, and then you're placing the soil. You have a divot in front from putting the soil in. You fill that with coarse material to create a bit of a drain. That's what you see in a lot of the more modern terrace systems. And I mean, you can get really crazy with it. You go to Machu Picchu, where those terraces are basically all riser fill. They're made out of multiple alternating layers of crushed stone and dust and gravel and large rocks in a very, very sort of engineered and technical fashion that are designed specifically to drain effectively, perfectly. And the riser fill is something that is debated heavily. Is it really a drainage thing? Is it a oops, we need to fill in the space thing? It seems it's a drainage thing because there are so many different elaborations on it.
Other questions? Yes, please.
This is really exciting. Thank you so much. We have found some correlation with dating and some of those techniques, terrace construction techniques in Kitira. And I don't know if it's a fluke, but we have identified 3 different techniques. One is like the vertical, like terraces vertical cutting into the rock. And then we have the shallow digging of the earth and just, the stone wall piling up against that. And then we have, I think, what you're describing as the riser filling, because we have a combination of stone and soil kind of deposits along. So what's really interesting is the dates that we're getting back. I mean, there's big urgent margin errors, of course, with OSL dates, but the ones that are most interesting are we're getting Bronze Age dates, which is great, and they seem to be, we're getting prehistoric dates for 2 of the types of construction terraces, and that is the vertical cutting, and the rising.
Okay. When you say vertical cutting, you mean cutting into the substrate.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Now the other one has given us medieval dates. So
which one is that?
So that's the shallow digging. So I don't know if it's a fluke.
There are some medieval specialists who would have a lot to say about that.
Right. So anyway, so like it's really interesting that we're getting different dates for different techniques, and these are sites are very close to each other. And I think in the one site we have both techniques which are prehistoric but different, and it could be the drainage issue that you were talking about, because there is some major water management works going on in those terraces. And they're still used today, but we are thinking that they may actually be older. So, I mean, we're still working on this. So we really want to do more and find out, the relationship between those waterworks and the actual terraces. But we are getting prehistoric dates, so it's kind of exciting.
What's prehistoric?
We're getting the 1500 BC dates. Yeah. Nothing earlier than that.
Yeah, just trained in my city in archaeology. I don't call that prehistoric.
Other questions?
I just want to ask about the effort and time it took to analyze these finds, because it looks like a lot of data or that I look into, and there's a lot of sites you have to work on, not just time and effort, time and the manpower and the effort. And I have one more question.
Okay, well, I can answer that one easily.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time.
No effort.
Oh, no effort. The most time consuming, they're all very prescribed methods. So that you do step A, step B, step C all the time. I mean, it's very simple in that respect, and so the workflow is relatively easy to manage. But you have to consider that when I'm doing the POSL, each sample takes 2 minutes and 45 seconds to do all of the different measurements when I put it in, and then there's the time to transfer the thing. So I can do, in an 8-hour work day, I can maybe get through 30 or 40 samples if I'm really working myself, bleeding. The PXRF depends. In the field I do 2 measurements on 2 different calibration settings, one for geochemistry and one for soils. And the soil setting is 50 seconds, the geochemistry setting is 30 seconds, and I multiply that by 5 to do my laboratory protocol. But for the field we have 135 measurements, so do that math. And then for the lab, I'm almost done with all of them, and it's over 1,000 measurements, I think. And so it is time consuming. I think under other circumstances, there wouldn't be one person doing all this. But I didn't have funding for a graduate student, so who would share in the research and help me immeasurably, I'm certain, but that is the reality of it. Is it's a very brute force method in that respect. You have to process a lot of data, and the POSL means you're in a dark room by yourself, and I'm literally doing this in a bomb bunker. No, I'm not joking. It was originally a bomb shelter, and that's perfectly, sauna insulated and light insulated, and so you get a little loopy after a couple of hours. Especially when the sound because the people in the ancient DNA lab is adjacent, and we share ventilation, and so you can hear their audio book or their Ariana Grande sort of faintly coming through all the filters, and you start to think someone's talking to you. But it is a lot of time. But it is sort of prescribed enough that you can calculate the workflow. You tell me it's 100 samples, I'll tell you, okay, that's probably going to be 2.5 weeks of work plus final analysis. An average for the POSL on a given site, we generally do 4 to 5 profiles for our smaller sites than this, and that's roughly a month's worth of processing time total for everything.
Other questions? So let's see. We have a question from line, and it will be the last one. Okay.
All right, not my area, but I know how to answer the question. So, if you were in a zone with good preservation, how would you go about interpreting it? Differentiating between DNA introduced via manure versus crops and weeds growing in situ. That's a good question. So part of that you would look at is exactly how much you are actually getting. If you're getting quite a lot of a particular thing, this is probably what's being grown. The other thing is that when we look for manure, we're not necessarily looking for the same things that we're looking for in growing. So with manure, you're often looking for spores, not plants. But the spores come out in the same protocols that we have for plants and mammals. so we can see if we're having a strong animal dung component by the spore content. We also, it's important that DNA is not a magic bullet. You do the DNA alongside phytoliths. You do a DNA alongside spherulites. You're looking at all of the microscopic information, because even if you have a bunch of, if you have a bunch of wheat DNA, but you're absent the relevant phytoliths, you have to explain that. And you can explain that through cultivation or threshing or harvesting processes. You can also explain that through taphonomy. However, the conditions that would eradicate phytoliths would most certainly eradicate DNA. So you have to answer. You have to so answer that. So the short answer is, you're not really differentiating between things unless you're getting something that doesn't make sense being in your terrace. So there is some subjectivity there at this point. What you would do generally is you would treat this statistically, and you would actually do a PCA to see if there's any groupings amongst your DNA data to say that, oh, these things are occurring together in similar circumstances. This seems to be manure. These are occurring together. This seems to be, plant droppings during the fallow period or things like this. So that's my answer. Good.
Any other questions? Right. So in this case, let us all thank Daniel.